It is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon a renunciation of instinct. Sigmund Freud. Like many before him, and scores yet to follow, a young Steven Pinker struggled with the burdensome rules known all over the world as table manners. Sit up straight, keep your elbows off the table, wait until everyone is served to start eating, so on and so forth. While he, like many others, understood and agreed with some of the more obvious rules, like not talking with food in your mouth or not chewing your food too loudly, it was just that some of the rules were too particular, to the point of silliness and even inconvenience, like the rule that advises to never guide food onto your fork with your knife. This rule is fine for, say, large chunks of beefy steak, but whoever made the rule clearly did not have to contend with finely diced cubes or the slippery little spheres called peas that ricochet and roll at the touch of the tines. Young Pinker often rebelled, often questioned why he had to follow these annoyingly restrictive rules. Often, in return, he would receive the non-negotiable and authoritarian yet admittedly evasive answer loathed by children like him across the world, "Because I said so." For decades, young Pinker would grow into a not-so-young Pinker, silently grumbling about the unintelligibility of the rules of etiquette, and he was right. What right did grown-ups have to enforce rules whose origins they didn't have a clue about? Sadly though, young Pinker, now old Pinker, would find himself as just another adult following table manners without knowing why these rules were so important to the existence of modern man. But luckily for him, he did develop a keen interest in studying why people nowadays don't kill each other as much as they used to in ancient times. In studying this decline in global homicidal murder rates, he would finally, after all these years, enjoy the Eureka moment in finding out how table manners are just one among the many sets of rules that helped in making humanity abandon its primal instinct for violence, destruction, and bloody conquest. Pinker discovered the works of Norbert Elias, a thinker of unrecognized brilliance. Born in Breslau, Germany, Norbert's origins in this place were shadowed by adversity, forcing his escape in 1933 due to his Jewish heritage, a heritage that would cost him the lives of his parents to the Holocaust. Adding insult to injury, his sanctuary, Britain, detained him, seeing not a refugee, but a German invader in his guise. Further still, he would later release his magnum opus titled The Civilizing Process, a book about structured progression toward greater civility and restraint in personal behavior, released in 1939 Germany, a country whose ruling regime was perpetrating extreme violence, genocide, and widespread repression. To say the book was tragically ill-timed is an understatement. It would have been like releasing a book on the dangers of cocaine production in 1980's Medellin, Colombia. The book didn't receive much critical acclaim. After arduous years as a college professor, vagabonding from one university to the next, teaching mostly night classes before finally settling down at the University of Leicester and an English translation of his book, he would at last, in the last decade of his life, receive his much-deserved credit for making great discoveries about the history of homicide. A lot of us have the perception that our world is getting more and more violent. When Steven Pinker surveyed perceptions of violence through an internet questionnaire, people guessed, and guessed wrongly, that 20th century England was about 14% more violent than 14th century England. In stark contrast, it was dramatically 95% less violent. And mind you, this is only deaths due to homicide, not events like the Great Famine and the Black Death. The human mind tends to estimate the probability of an event from the ease with which it can recall examples, and scenes of carnage are more likely to be beamed into our homes and burned into our memories than footage of people dying of old age. No matter how small the number of homicides in any given society, there will always be enough to fill the daily news. Although he would later come to be proven right by more conventional statistical studies done by other scientists, Elias's theory of the civilizing process was initially developed not through hard numbers and cold facts, but by examining the texture of everyday life in medieval Europe. This was achieved through means such as the following reproduction of an illustration from the 15th century German manuscript, the medieval house book, depicting daily medieval life as seen through the eyes of an actual knight. In the image, a peasant disembowels a horse as a pig sniffs his exposed buttocks. In a nearby cave, a man and a woman sit in stocks. Above them, a man is being led to the gallows, where a corpse is already hanging, and next to it, a man who has been broken on the wheel, his shattered body pecked by a crow. Neither the wheel nor the gibbet dominates the scene. Instead, they merge into the landscape, as commonplace as the trees and hills, as unremarkable as the dirt beneath the feet. Now, keep in mind that that was just an ordinary day in the life through the eyes of a medieval knight. Now, let's look at a second drawing detailing a day when the same knight went out with his knight comrades to attack a rival village. In the lower left, a peasant is stabbed by a soldier. Above him, another peasant is restrained by his shirt tail, while a woman, hands in the air, cries out. At the lower right, a peasant is being stabbed in a chapel while his possessions are plundered, and nearby, another peasant in fetters is cudgeled by a knight. Above them, a group of horsemen are setting fire to a farmhouse, while one of them drives off the farmer's cattle and strikes at his wife. Knights, far from the chivalrous figures of film, were in truth what we would now simply call warlords, agents of chaos and control. The next question we should be asking ourselves is, why? Why are we so bad at seeing how much better we have it compared to our predecessors? Why are a large chunk of us wrongly convinced that the world is getting more and more violent when the opposite is in fact happening? The answer to that is very long and multifaceted. It could be the Hollywood movies that paint a picture of the good old days in the glorious past, or it could be the news that shows us a new public mass shooting every other day, or the activities of a remote terrorist group creating new wars in the Middle East, or it could be the human tendency towards pessimism. Everyone notices and makes a point of remembering the bad, but doesn't give a second thought to the good. The aphorisms, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You're only as good as your last success, and damned if you do, damned if you don't, perfectly echo this human propensity to focus on the negative. Violence is still a problem in the modern world, that can't be denied, but what most people fail to ponder is just how greatly reduced it is in the grand scheme of things. Robert Gurr, following in the steps of Norbert Elias before him, scoured old court and county records. He then calculated 30 estimates of homicide rates at various times in English history, combined them with modern records from London, and plotted them on a graph. The results were astonishing. So astonishing, in fact, that they would have to be displayed on a logarithmic scale in order to capture the homicide rate that declined so precipitously. The graph shows that from the 13th century to the 20th, homicide in various parts of England plummeted by a factor of 10, 50, and in some cases 100. For example, from 110 homicides per 100,000 people per year in 14th century Oxford to less than 1 homicide per 100,000 in mid-20th century London. Now, what does any of this have to do with table manners? To answer this question, we will have to go back to our man, Nobert Elias. As I mentioned earlier, unlike those who came after him and who proved his theories to be correct using raw data and logarithmic graphs, Norbert developed the theory of the civilizing process, not by poring over numbers, but by examining the texture of everyday life in medieval Europe. In his observations of this daily life, he noted that the little people too, the hatters, the tailors, the shepherds, were all quick to draw their knives. Even clergymen got into the act. The historian Barbara Hannawalt quotes an account from 14th century England. It happened at Ulvertoft on Saturday next before Martinmas in the 5th year of King Edward that a certain William of Wellington, parish chaplain of Ulvertoft, sent John, his clerk, to John Cobbler's house to buy a candle for him for a penny. But John would not send it to him without the money, wherefore William became enraged, and knocking in the door upon him, he struck John in the front part of the head so that his brains flowed forth and he died forthwith. Violence also stained their entertainment, mirroring the brutality of their lives. Players with hands tied behind them competed to kill a cat nailed to a post by battering it to death with their heads, at the risk of cheeks ripped open or eyes scratched out by the frantic animal's claws, or a pig enclosed in a wide pen was chased by men with clubs to the laughter of spectators as he ran squealing from the blows until beaten lifeless. Barbara W. Tuchman writes of the childishness noticeable in medieval behavior, with its marked inability to restrain any kind of impulse. Naturally, Nobert Elias wasn't able to come to his conclusions by only looking at books on table manners. He did more than that. However, by looking at such books, he was able at the very least to come to the conclusion that people of the Middle Ages were, in a word, gross. By laying down rules for what people ought not to have done, these manuals give us a snapshot of what people must have been doing. Some of the rules found in etiquette books included: don't foul the staircases, corridors, closets, or wall hangings with urine or other filth. Don't relieve yourself in front of ladies or before doors or windows of court chambers. Don't slide back and forth on your chair as if you're trying to pass gas. Don't touch your private parts under your clothes with your bare hands. Don't greet someone while they are urinating or defecating. Don't make noise when you pass gas. Don't undo your clothes in front of other people in preparation for defecating, or do them up afterwards. When you share a bed with someone in an inn, don't lie so close to him that you touch him, and don't put your legs between his. If you come across something disgusting in the sheet, don't turn to your companion and point it out to him, or hold up the stinking thing for the other to smell and say, "I should like to know how much that stinks." Public nudity was commonplace, and couples often took only the most cursory steps to shield their intimacy from public view. Prostitutes offered their services openly. In many English towns, the red light district was called Grope Cunt Lane. Men would discuss their sexual exploits with their children, and a man's illegitimate offspring would mix with his legitimate ones. During the transition to modernity, this openness came to be frowned upon as uncouth and then as unacceptable. As humans continued tending towards civility, they began inventing more and more appropriate table utensils like the fork and special knives that were designed with rounded ends rather than pointed ends. Certain foods were never to be cut with a knife, such as fish, round objects, and bread, hence the expression, to break bread together. Before these advancements in utensils, people in the Middle Ages used to carry their own knives in their pockets because when they visited an inn, no utensils were provided at all. In certain instances, one single roasted carcass was provided, and people would simply just pull out their knife and use it at the dinner table to carve a chunk of meat, spear it, and bring it to their mouths. For this purpose, they created the following rules. Don't pick your teeth with your knife. Don't hold your knife the entire time you are eating, but only when you are using it. Don't use the tip of your knife to put food into your mouth. Don't cut bread, break it. If you pass someone a knife, take the point in your hand and offer him the handle. Don't clutch your knife with your whole hand like a stick, but hold it in your fingers. Don't use your knife to point at someone. These findings regarding table manners by Elias were of course just part of a larger psychological change. Elias posited that over a span of several centuries, beginning in the 11th or 12th and maturing in the 17th and 18th, people increasingly inhibited their impulses, anticipated the long-term consequences of their actions, and took other people's thoughts and feelings into consideration. Instead of a culture of honor, the readiness to take revenge gave way to a culture of dignity, the readiness to control one's emotions. These ideals were inspired by the few cultural arbiters in society who were able to see past their times and into the distant civilized future, and over decades and decades, these ideals slowly seeped themselves into the DNA of the greater population and were absorbed into the socialization of younger and younger children until they became second nature.